The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the trees as Mike Thompson loaded his gear into his old pickup truck. The familiar smell of coffee wafted from his trusty thermos as he double-checked his hunting supplies, a ritual he followed every hunting season for the past 20 years. His wife had packed him extra sandwiches, just like she always did, telling him with a smile that he needed to stay alert out there in the woods. The drive to his favorite hunting spot was peaceful, with country music playing softly on the radio and the occasional deer crossing sign catching his eye. Mike couldn't help but smile as he passed the old Jensen farm, remembering all the times he'd helped Mr. Jensen fix his tractor in exchange for permission to hunt on his land. Those were good memories, simple times that made life worth living. As he parked his truck at the forest entrance, Mike noticed something different about the woods today. Maybe it was the way the fog hung low between the trees, or perhaps it was just his hunter's instinct, but something felt off. He shouldered his backpack, adjusted his bright orange safety vest, and started down his usual trail, dried leaves crunching softly beneath his boots. The forest was alive with its morning symphony, birds calling to each other, squirrels scampering through the branches, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mike had always loved these sounds. They reminded him of hunting trips with his dad when he was just a boy, learning to read the forest's signs and respect its ways. Following a familiar deer trail, Mike moved quietly through the underbrush, his experienced eyes scanning for any movement. He'd seen plenty of fresh tracks this morning, more than usual actually. But something else caught his attention, something that didn't quite fit with the forest's natural rhythm. At first, it was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. A sound that didn't belong among the usual forest noises, a whimper barely audible over the whisper of the wind through the trees. Mike stopped in his tracks, years of hunting experience telling him to trust his instincts. There it was again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Most hunters might have ignored it, focused on their original purpose. But Mike had always believed that the woods had a way of putting you exactly where you needed to be. His dad had taught him that, along with the importance of paying attention to the unexpected. The whimpering sound grew slightly louder, carried on a sudden gust of wind. Mike checked his watch, noting the early hour. He still had plenty of daylight ahead of him, and something about that sound tugged at his conscience. 20 years of hunting in these woods had taught him that sometimes the most important things happen when you least expect them. Adjusting his course, he began moving carefully toward the source of the sound, his hunting plans temporarily forgotten. The undergrowth grew thicker as he moved away from his usual path, thorny bushes catching at his clothes. The whimpering was getting clearer now, taking on a distinctly canine quality that made Mike's heart beat a little faster. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone's pet gotten lost out here? Or was it something else entirely? As he pushed through a particularly dense patch of brush, Mike could feel that he was getting close. The morning fog was starting to lift, sunlight streaming through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating particles of dust and pollen in the air. He paused for a moment, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the exact direction of the sound. That's when he noticed something else, tire tracks in the soft earth, fresh ones that had no business being this deep in the woods. Little did Mike know that what he was about to discover would make this ordinary hunting morning anything but ordinary. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he took his next steps, leading him towards something that would change not just his day, but the lives of several others as well. Mike pushed through the last bit of thick undergrowth, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The whimpering sound was clear now, and as he rounded a massive oak tree, his heart nearly stopped. There, tied to the trunk with what looked like a length of rope, was a German shepherd, its coat dusty and matted. The dog's ears perked up at Mike's approach, but what struck him most wasn't fear or aggression in the animal's eyes, it was something else entirely. The dog's gaze held an intelligence, an urgency that made Mike's skin prickle. He'd grown up around hunting dogs, spent countless hours training them, and he knew when an animal was trying to tell you something. "Hey there, buddy," Mike said softly, keeping his voice steady and calm. He slowly set down his hunting gear, making sure his movements weren't threatening. The German shepherd watched him intently, tail giving a slight wag, not the happy greeting of a casual encounter, but more like recognition that help had finally arrived. As Mike got closer, he could see signs of dehydration in the dog's sunken eyes and dry nose. The rope around its neck wasn't cruel tight, but it was secure. Someone had definitely meant for this dog to stay put. "Let's get you some water, friend," Mike murmured, reaching for his canteen. His mind was already racing with questions. Who would leave a dog like this? And why here, so far from any trails? The German Shepherd lapped eagerly at the water Mike poured into his cupped hand, but every few seconds, the dog's attention would snap back to something behind them. Mike followed the dog's gaze toward a steep ravine that dropped away from the back of the oak tree. Each time the dog looked that way, a high-pitched whine escaped its throat. Looking more closely at the animal, Mike noticed its quality. This wasn't some abandoned stray. The dog's build and features showed good breeding. Despite its current state, the coat had the healthy thickness of a well-cared-for pet, and around its neck was a worn but good quality collar. Mike gently turned the tag to read it, Scout. The name was engraved alongside a phone number, but the digits were too worn to make out. Scout's behavior became more agitated as Mike examined him. The dog would drink, then look toward the ravine, drink again, then look back, pulling against the rope with increasing urgency. 20 years of hunting had taught Mike to trust his gut, and right now, every instinct was telling him something was seriously wrong. He noticed other signs too, broken branches and disturbed earth around the tree, as if there had been some kind of struggle. But it was the fresh tire tracks that really caught his attention. They led toward the ravine and just stopped. In all his years hunting these woods, Mike had never seen vehicle tracks this far in. The area was protected, off-limits to motorized vehicles. Someone had broken those rules, and recently. "What are you trying to tell me, Scout?" Mike asked quietly, watching as the dog's eyes locked onto his with an almost human-like desperation. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning away the last wisps of fog, but the air felt heavy with tension. Scout's whimpers had taken on a new urgency, and the dog was now straining toward the ravine with all its strength. Mike stood up slowly, his joints creaking a bit, a reminder that he wasn't as young as he used to be. He walked a few steps toward the ravine's edge, and Scout's whining intensified. The dog wasn't just acting strange, it was trying to lead him somewhere. Mike had heard stories about dogs like this, loyal animals going for help when their owners were in trouble. He'd always believed them, had seen enough of dogs' intelligence over the years to know they were capable of incredible things. The whole situation felt wrong. The tied-up dog, the mysterious tracks, the ravine that Scout couldn't take his eyes off of. Mike's hunting plans were completely forgotten now. Whatever was going on here, he had a feeling he was exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. As Scout let out another urgent whine, Mike made his decision. Something or someone was down that ravine, and he was going to find out what. Mike's years of tracking experience kicked in as he began examining the area around the oak tree more carefully. He'd learned long ago that the woods always tell a story if you know how to read the signs. Something about those tire tracks bothered him. They were deep, like whatever vehicle made them had been carrying a heavy load. "All right, Scout," he said softly, giving the dog another drink from his canteen. "Let's figure out what happened here." The German Shepherd's eyes never left him as Mike crouched down to study the ground. His weathered hands brushed away some leaves, revealing more than just tire tracks. There were footprints too, and they told a concerning story. The prints showed signs of stumbling, like someone had been struggling to walk. They appeared alongside the tire tracks, sometimes crossing over them, which meant whoever made them had been moving back and forth around the vehicle. Mike's mind flashed back to the times he'd helped his neighbor track lost cattle. This had that same feeling of piecing together a puzzle, but something felt much more urgent about this one. Standing up, Mike pulled out his old flip phone, the kind his kids always teased him about keeping. Out here in the woods, these old phones often got better reception than the fancy smartphones. But today, the signal bars showed nothing. He was too deep in the forest, the surrounding hills blocking any chance of calling for help. That fact settled heavy in his stomach as Scout let out another worried whine. The morning had grown warmer, and Mike shrugged off his hunting jacket, draping it over a nearby branch. His wife had tried to get him to buy a new one last season, but he liked this one. It had years of memories woven into its worn fabric. As he moved, something caught his eye near the base of the tree where Scout was tied. Bending down, he picked up a set of keys. They weren't just any keys. These were ATV keys, with a distinctive red rubber grip that was covered in dirt. Mike turned them over in his hand, noticing a small metal tag attached to the ring. The tag had a name and phone number stamped into it, but like Scout's collar, the information was too worn to read clearly. One thing was certain: these keys and that dog belonged to the same person. Scout's behavior changed as Mike held up the keys. The dog's tail wagged faster, and its whining took on a new pitch. Mike had spent enough time around hunting dogs to recognize when they were trying to tell you something important. He'd seen it before when his old hunting dog had once led him to an injured fawn, that same urgent, insistent communication. Moving carefully toward the ravane's edge, Mike began to notice more signs that something was wrong. Broken branches formed a clear path down the steep slope, and the earth was torn up in a way that spoke of something heavy passing through. His stomach tightened as he spotted a piece of twisted metal caught in a bush. It looked like it had come from an ATV. The sun had climbed higher now, its rays breaking through the canopy to illuminate the forest floor in patches. In one of these bright spots, Mike noticed something that made him pause: a small first aid kit, its contents spilled across the leaves. Some of the bandages were missing, and there were spots of dried blood on the plastic case. Someone had needed medical help, and recently. Scout's whimpers had become almost constant now, the dog straining against the rope with renewed energy every time Mike moved closer to the ravine. He'd been hunting these woods for 2 decades, knew every trail and hollow, but he'd never felt anything quite like this. The clues were adding up to something that made his heart race. Someone was in trouble down there. Taking a deep breath, Mike made his decision. He couldn't leave Scout tied to the tree, but he also couldn't risk the dog running off if whatever was down that ravine needed help. With gentle hands, he untied the rope from the tree, but left it attached to Scout's collar as a makeshift leash. The German Shepherd immediately tried to pull him toward the ravine, showing surprising strength despite its tired state. The descent into the ravine was treacherous, with loose rocks shifting under Mike's boots with each step. He kept a firm grip on Scout's makeshift leash while using his other hand to steady himself against trees and rocks. The morning dew had made everything slick, and one wrong step could send them both tumbling down the steep slope. Scout seemed to know exactly where to go, carefully picking a path down the ravine that was easier to navigate. Mike couldn't help but be impressed by the dog's intelligence. It was almost as if Scout had made this journey before. Every few feet, the German Shepherd would stop and look back at Mike, making sure he was following, those brown eyes filled with an almost human-like worry. The ravine was deeper than it had looked from above, with thick undergrowth that made visibility difficult. As they descended, Mike started noticing more disturbing signs: broken branches, scraped bark on trees, and deep gouges in the earth that looked like they'd been made by something heavy dragging or falling. His heart was pounding now, but not from the physical effort of the climb. About halfway down, Mike's boot caught on something metallic. Pushing aside some branches, he discovered a side mirror that clearly belonged to an ATV. It had been ripped clean off, and there were traces of red paint on its edges. The discovery made his stomach tighten. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been gentle. Scout's behavior became more urgent as they neared the bottom of the ravine. The dog was pulling harder now, letting out short, sharp barks, the first real sounds it had made besides whimpering. Mike had to remind himself to stay calm and alert. In his 20 years of hunting, he'd helped with search and rescue operations before, and he knew that rushing in without assessing the situation could make things worse. The ground leveled out slightly, opening into a small clearing surrounded by dense brush. That's when Mike saw it, the back end of an ATV protruding from behind a fallen tree. The vehicle was lying on its side, its red paint scratched and muddy, one wheel still spinning slowly in the morning breeze. But it was what he saw next that made his blood run cold. A hand was visible, reaching out from beneath the overturned ATV. It was weathered and pale, clearly belonging to an older person. Mike's training kicked in immediately. He'd taken first aid courses for his hunting license, and now he was grateful for every minute of that training. "Hello," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "Can you hear me?" Scout had started circling the ATV, whining continuously now. The dog's behavior confirmed what Mike had suspected. This was Scout's owner trapped under there. Moving closer, Mike could see that the person was still breathing, but their breaths were shallow and uneven. They seemed to be unconscious, pinned beneath the heavy machine in a way that looked painfully uncomfortable. The situation was delicate. Mike knew from his first aid training that moving someone with potential injuries could make things worse, but leaving them trapped wasn't an option either. He needed to assess the situation carefully. Setting down his hunting gear, he pulled out his flashlight to better examine how the ATV was positioned. The morning light didn't reach this far down into the ravine, and shadows made it difficult to see clearly. The victim's position told the story. They had clearly been thrown from the ATV as it tumbled down the ravine, but had ended up trapped when it rolled over. What amazed Mike was realizing that despite their injuries, they had somehow managed to tie Scout to that tree up above, probably hoping the dog would attract attention. It was a clever last resort that had likely saved their life. Time was critical now. Mike could see that the trapped person's clothes were damp from the morning dew, which meant they'd been here at least overnight. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s last night, dangerous conditions for someone unable to move. As he considered his next steps, Scout pressed against his leg, as if sensing his concern. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that he wasn't handling this emergency alone. Mike's hands shook slightly as he pulled off his thick hunting gloves and reached down to check the trapped man's pulse. It was there, weak but steady. The elderly man's skin felt cold, but he was alive. As Mike gently touched his shoulder, the man's eyes flickered open, confusion giving way to relief as he saw another human face. "Been here 2 days," the man whispered, his voice rough from dehydration. "Name's Frank." He tried to move but winced, and Mike quickly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Easy there," Mike said softly. "I'm Mike. Your dog Scout here, he led me to you. Smart boy you've got." At the mention of his name, Scout pressed closer, gently licking Frank's exposed hand. The simple gesture brought tears to the old man's eyes. "Knew he'd find someone," Frank managed to say. "Tied him up there, used the last bit of strength I had. Figured someone might hear him." He paused, breathing heavily from the effort of speaking. Mike quickly pulled out his canteen, helping Frank take small sips of water. "You did exactly the right thing," he assured him, noting how Frank's hands trembled from cold and exhaustion. As he helped him drink, Frank explained in broken sentences what had happened. He was a local beekeeper, checking on his remote hives when his ATV hit an unseen obstacle, sending them tumbling down the ravine. The story came out slowly, how Frank had been thrown from the ATV, how it had rolled and pinned him, trapping his leg but thankfully not crushing it. How Scout had stayed by his side that first night, keeping him warm as temperatures dropped. How on the second morning, realizing he needed help, Frank had used his remaining strength to secure Scout where the dog might be found. "My wife." Frank's voice cracked with emotion. "She must be worried sick." Mike nodded understanding, thinking of his own wife at home. "We're going to get you out of here," he promised, already assessing the situation. The ATV wasn't completely crushing Frank. It had landed in a way that created a small space, which had probably saved his life. But moving it would be tricky. Mike began gathering fallen branches, using his hunting knowledge to find the strongest ones. He could use them as levers to lift the ATV just enough to help Frank slide free. As he worked, he kept talking to Frank, keeping him alert and conscious. He learned that Frank had been keeping bees for over 40 years, that Scout was from a litter born in his own barn, that his wife made the best honey cookies in 3 counties. The morning sun had risen higher, sending shafts of light through the trees that illuminated their small clearing. Mike positioned the branches carefully, remembering the physics he'd learned years ago, helping his father move fallen trees after storms. "All right, Frank," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "When I lift, I need you to try and slide yourself out. Can you move your legs at all?" Frank nodded weakly. Left one's trapped but not badly hurt. Right one's free. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the moment, standing alert nearby, watching every move. Mike took a deep breath, positioned himself carefully, and began to apply pressure to his makeshift lever. The ATV groaned as it shifted slightly. Frank gritted his teeth, using his good leg to push himself inch by painful inch. Scout whined anxiously, moving closer as if wanting to help. Almost there, Mike encouraged, his muscles straining with effort. Just a little more. With a final push and pull, Frank was free. Mike quickly but carefully helped him move away from the ATV, doing a rapid assessment of his injuries. The trapped leg was scraped and bruised but not broken, a miracle considering the circumstances. Frank was dehydrated, cold, and exhausted, but he was alive. Wrapping Frank in his own hunting jacket, Mike held the canteen to his lips again. Scout pressed against Frank's other side, providing warmth and comfort. The dog's tail wagged non-stop now, and the relief in those intelligent eyes was almost human-like. As Frank took small sips of water, Mike couldn't help but marvel at the bond between man and dog, how Scout's loyalty and intelligence had literally saved his master's life. Mike reached for his old flip phone again, holding it up at different angles, searching for even a single bar of signal. Down in the ravine, the chances were even slimmer than they had been up top. Frank watched these efforts through tired eyes, his hand absently stroking Scout's fur. "There's a ridge," he said softly, "about quarter-mile east. Higher ground." Drawing on his years of woodland experience, Mike knew Frank was right. Elevation was their best chance at getting help. But he couldn't leave Frank alone, not in his condition. The morning had warmed somewhat, but Frank's clothes were still damp from the dew, and his body temperature needed to stabilize. "Think you can walk if I help you?" Mike asked, already gathering his gear. Frank nodded determinedly, though his face showed concern. "My bees," he said suddenly, trying to sit up straighter. "The hives need checking." Mike couldn't help but smile at the man's dedication. Even after 2 days trapped in the wilderness, he was thinking about his bees. Getting Frank to his feet was a careful process. Mike supported him on one side while Scout pressed against his other leg, providing an extra point of balance. The dog seemed to understand exactly what was needed, moving slowly and steadily as Frank took his first shaky steps. Despite the pain he must have been in, Frank didn't complain. He just set his jaw and kept moving. As they made their slow way toward higher ground, Frank shared more about his life between careful breaths. He'd started beekeeping right after he got married, turning his wife's small honey business into something that supported their family through tough times. Scout was actually a descendant of their very first farm dog, part of a bloodline that had protected their property for generations. "My wife always says," Frank managed a weak chuckle, "that our dogs are smarter than most people she knows." Mike thought about Scout's determination to get help, how the dog had stayed by Frank's side through that first cold night, and couldn't disagree. They'd paused to rest against a large boulder, and Mike gave Frank more water from the canteen. The ridge wasn't far now, but the terrain was challenging. Mike found himself wishing he paid more attention to those first aid courses he'd taken for his hunting license. Still, he remembered the basics: keep the patient talking, watch for signs of shock, maintain body temperature. He draped his hunting jacket around Frank's shoulders, and the older man clutched it gratefully. Finally reaching higher ground, Mike held up his phone again. 1 bar, it wasn't much, but it was enough. His hands shook slightly as he dialed emergency services, years of hunting experience helping him describe their location with precise detail. The dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but it would take time to reach their remote location. Scout's ears perked up long before Mike heard anything. The distant thump of helicopter blades grew steadily louder, and Mike used his emergency flashlight to signal their position. The medical team that rappelled down worked with skilled efficiency, checking Frank's vitals and preparing him for transport. One of the paramedics, listening to Frank's story, looked at Scout with admiration. "Smart dog you've got there," she said, checking Frank's blood pressure. Not many people would have thought to secure their dog where it could be found. Frank's eyes were tired but proud as he watched Scout, who hadn't moved more than a few feet away since the rescue began. The helicopter crew had brought emergency blankets and supplies, making Frank more comfortable as they prepared for evacuation. They wanted to airlift him directly to the hospital. 2 days of exposure and dehydration needed proper medical attention. Frank reached for Mike's hand before they loaded him into the rescue basket. "Don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't found Scout." Mike squeezed his hand gently. "Thank your dog," he replied. "I was just following his lead." Scout watched the entire process intently, and the rescue team, impressed by the dog's calm demeanor, agreed to let him ride in the helicopter alongside his owner. As they secured Frank for transport, Mike could see the relief in both man and dog. Neither would have to spend another night in the cold forest. 3 weeks after the rescue, Mike pulled up to Frank's farmhouse in his old pickup truck. The gravel driveway was lined with blooming wildflowers, and the gentle hum of bees filled the air. Scout's bark announced his arrival before he could even step out of the vehicle, and the German Shepherd came bounding around the corner of the house, tail wagging furiously. "Well, look who's back to full strength," Mike laughed as Scout circled him excitedly. The dog looked completely different now, coat gleaming, eyes bright, full of energy. It was hard to believe this was the same exhausted animal he'd found tied to that tree just weeks ago. Frank appeared on the porch, walking with just a slight limp now. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The doctors had said Frank was lucky. Despite his ordeal, he'd escaped with no permanent injuries. The hospital stay had been shorter than expected, largely thanks to how quickly he'd been found and rescued. "Mike," Frank called out warmly. "Just in time, the honey harvest is starting." He gestured toward the bee yards visible behind the house, where white boxes stretched in neat rows. Mike could smell the sweet scent of honey on the breeze as he walked up to greet them. Frank's wife had tears in her eyes as she hugged Mike, whispering a thank you that carried the weight of all their worry and relief. They settled on the porch, where a pitcher of fresh lemonade waited alongside a plate of honey cookies. "Best in 3 counties," Frank reminded Mike with a wink, referring to their conversation during the rescue. Mike had to agree. They were possibly the best cookies he'd ever tasted. As they talked, Scout lay contentedly at Frank's feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on everyone. The bond between man and dog had grown even stronger after their ordeal. Frank's wife shared how Scout had been inconsolable during Frank's hospital stay, sleeping by the door each night, waiting for his master's return. "We've got something to show you," Frank said after a while, nodding to his wife. She disappeared into the house and returned carrying a small bundle of fur, a German Shepherd puppy just old enough to leave its mother. "From Scout's latest litter," Frank explained. "We'd like you to have him." Mike's throat tightened with emotion as the puppy was placed in his arms. The little dog looked up at him with bright, intelligent eyes that reminded him so much of Scout's. "Are you sure?" he asked, even as the puppy snuggled into his chest. Frank nodded firmly. "Scout's pups are special, smart, loyal, just like their dad. This little guy deserves a good home, and we can't think of anyone better." The local newspaper had run a story about the rescue, praising both Mike's quick thinking and Scout's incredible loyalty. But sitting there on the porch, watching the puppy drift off to sleep in his arms, while Scout looked on approvingly, Mike felt the real story was something simpler, about trust, dedication, and the unexpected ways lives become connected. "What will you name him?" Frank's wife asked, smiling at how naturally the puppy had taken to Mike. Mike thought for a moment, looking out over the peaceful farm scene before them. "Hunter," he said finally. "Seems fitting given how we all met." Frank chuckled at that, reaching down to pat Scout's head. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the bee yards, Mike realized his hunting habits had changed since the rescue. He'd started taking different trails, paying more attention to sounds that seemed out of place. The woods had taught him an important lesson that day. Sometimes the most valuable things you find aren't what you're looking for. The puppy stirred in his arms, yawning widely before settling back to sleep. Scout had moved closer, resting his head on Mike's knee as if giving his approval to this new arrangement. Looking at them both, Mike understood that his solitary hunting days were over. From now on, he'd have a companion, a descendant of the brave dog who had shown him what true loyalty meant.